All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 16 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, and we're headed right into the second round of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. So you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 16. All right, let's start the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Chargers. This one, not a matchup that I'm super excited about for most positions and for the quarterback and tight end position. Bo Nix coming off of two games where he's had a bit of a lower ceiling, 16.5 fantasy points in week 15, 20 of 33, 130 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 23 yards on the ground. We threw those 3 interceptions against the Colts and then had 2 interceptions in week 13 against the Browns. So a little bit of a turnover bug as of late for Bo Nix. And this is a tough matchup against the Chargers on a short week. So I still think he is startable. But you guys know I just don't really like Thursday night games, and I just don't know if I feel great about this one, right? I've been pretty high on Bo Nix throughout the majority of the season, pretty early on in the season. He's still a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football. I think he still gives you a floor. I just don't know if there's a tremendous amount of upside due to the short week and due to the matchup here. So depends on what you got, but I think Bo Nix is just kind of startable if you need him. And we'll leave it at that. No tight ends that we need to go over when it comes to the Broncos. Tight ends, there's nobody here from a fantasy perspective that we can trust. Moving along to the Chargers, Justin Herbert dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury, coming off of a matchup where the game script was great. The matchup was great. He only had 14.8 fantasy points, 21 to 33, 195 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 1 interception. Tough matchup for Herbert as well, going up against the Broncos this week. So, yeah, I just have Justin Herbert as a sit. He's had 17 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games, 14 or less in 3 out of those 4 games. So I'm just staying away from Justin Herbert. Once again, short week, tough matchup. I just don't want to start Justin Herbert this week. I think you guys probably have better options available. When it comes to the Chargers tight ends, we might have an opportunity here. We talked about Stone Smart a little bit last week as a desperation stream, and if Will Dissly misses this week again, then sure, I suppose that Stone Smart could come through here and be one of these guys who is a desperation play, but the Broncos not that bad against tight ends. He only had 8 points last week, but yes, if Will Dissly does not play in week 16 and you're looking for 8-ish points, Stone Smart will probably give you that if you're desperate at tight end. But for the most part, I'm looking to avoid the Chargers tight ends as well here in week 16. Moving along, we're going to have 2 games on Saturday. So let's start with the early game. That's going to be the Texans traveling to face the Chiefs and CJ Stroud. Oh my goodness. We've had Stroud as a sit for the past couple weeks outside of the Jacksonville game. I was like, okay, maybe there's something here if you have to start him, and there wasn't even anything there. But 11.6 points this past week for Stroud, 18 of 26, 131 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I mean, listen, the Texans are winning football games, and they have a formula, but that formula and those victories don't equate to good fantasy numbers for CJ Stroud. And I've said it for more than 1 week now. You can drop CJ Stroud. I mean, are you going to have the confidence to start Stroud? I doubt it. It's not even that bad of a matchup this week against the Chiefs. They have not been fantastic. They haven't been great against quarterbacks at the same time, but this is still a good defense, and there's just no reason why you should start Stroud at this point. I mean, we've broken this down before. He has 3 games on the season over 18 fantasy points. It feels like it was years ago. Those were all before week 6. And since week 6, 17 or less points in every game and 14 or less points in every game except for 1. We're looking at like Kirk Cousins type numbers here where it's detrimental to your starting lineup to even consider CJ Stroud. He has 11 or less fantasy points in 4 of the last 6 games. I mean, it's that bad. Like I said, they're winning games, but it's not helping us in fantasy the way they're doing it. So no CJ Stroud this week, please. Dalton Schultz is also a sit for me. 3.3 points this past week, 4 targets, 2 catches, 13 receiving yards, not enough there. Now, we got a tricky one when it comes to the Chiefs this week because, as you know, Patrick Mahomes has been diagnosed with that high ankle sprain, a mild high ankle sprain. So his status is up in the air for the week. He hasn't been as good as of late. He's had a very up and down season. Was starting to string together some nice games where we could at least get a floor and trust that floor out of Mahomes. But his last 2 games, 15.7 or less fantasy points. So kind of back and forth on this one. If he plays this week, he's startable. And I'll just leave it at that. Not my favorite start, but he is startable because he's Mahomes. It's not a great matchup. I don't know if I love him this week, but we'll just have to kind of sit back and see what happens. If Carson Wentz gets the start, no thank you. I'm not going there. Once again, I mean, the Texans are giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so no thank you. Even in double quarterback super flex, I'm not risking my guy Carson Wentz. Kelsey, like that's the thing. Kelsey, Noah Gray, how are they impacted by the quarterback play here? If Mahomes plays, is he 100%? If Wentz gets to start, what does that look like for Kelsey and Gray? They're still startable as well. Noah Gray still in the streaming category. Kelsey just kind of in that you don't have anything better. You can roll with him. The Texans also pretty good against tight ends. So this just feels like not a great matchup, and a matchup for the most part here in Week 16, the second round of the playoffs, that I'm going to try to avoid the Chiefs starters and the Texans starters at quarterback and tight end. All right, the later game on Saturday is going to be the Steelers traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. We had Russell Wilson as a sit this past week. Probably going to have him as a sit again this week. It is a better matchup on paper. The last time he played the Ravens, he had 7.3 fantasy points, and George Pickens' status is still up in the air, and I'm, once again, very worried about George Pickens. I think he might miss this week, and I think he might miss next week. I think his fantasy season might be a wrap, but don't quote me. Don't go dropping Pickens. But from everything I've read, this is not a good injury for George Pickens, and the typical timeline here is 4 games, but we shall see. But yeah, no Pickens on the field. I said it last week, like, what is there for Russell Wilson? You know, a little Najee Harris, a little Pat Freiermuth. Calvin Austin did show up this past week, so there's that. But come on, it's the fantasy playoffs. I'm not trusting Russell Wilson this week. I just can't do it. We did talk about Pat Freiermuth getting a little bump this past week and being a good streaming option, and then it's a better matchup this week on paper against the Ravens. So he has 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, double digits in 3 straight games, 11.2 fantasy points this past week. Pat Freiermuth is a solid streaming option going into the week. And then we got the Ravens, and we are starting Lamar Jackson every single week, no matter what. 36.1 fantasy points this past week, his highest total on the season. 5 passing touchdowns, 21-25, 290 passing yards, and 65 yards on the ground against the Giants. Keep rolling with Lamar Jackson if you own him. It's worth noting the last time these two teams met in Week 11, he had his worst fantasy performance of the season on the road against Pittsburgh with 15.8 fantasy points. But yeah, you guys know me. I'm not benching Lamar Jackson if I have a player of his caliber. And I've said the same thing about Mark Andrews as of late. Got a lot of questions coming off the bye week about Mark Andrews. The Giants not that bad against tight ends. And he didn't have a monster day, but he was solid. He scored a touchdown, 10.4 fantasy points off of 2 catches and 2 targets. And has a touchdown in 3 straight games, and has been pretty dang solid. I mean, has scored a touchdown in every game since Week 6 except for 2. So you own Mark Andrews. I'm going to continue to roll with him. Worth noting, last time he played the Steelers, had a pretty bad day with 4.2 fantasy points, but I'm not going to panic here. If I got Andrews, I'm rolling with the punches. Isaiah Likely, way too inconsistent. Not trusting Isaiah Likely, 3.7 fantasy points this past week. So see what happens. Big divisional matchup here. Playoff implications for both teams here in Week 16. Moving into Sunday, let's start with the Giants and Falcons, and I'll try and make this as painless as possible for you guys. Let's set all Giants quarterbacks. I don't know if it's going to be DeVito or Boyle or Locke. Tommy DeVito has a concussion. Drew Lock dealing with a heel and elbow injury. Locke missed this past week. DeVito played. DeVito got the concussion. Tim Boyle stepped in, and Tim Boyle at least helped support Malik Neighbors have a solid day. But we're sitting all these players going into the week, and there's no tight end option on this team as well. So avoid all Giants players at quarterback and tight end if you weren't already doing so. I've been very vocal for weeks and weeks and weeks before it kind of became a trend about sitting Kirk Cousins. And yes, we will continue to sit Kirk Cousins. Showed a little bit of life early in the game, and he thought maybe there's something there after that touchdown to Drake London, and he was 11 of 17, 112 passing yards, the one passing touchdown, one interception, 7.4 fantasy points. Just no thank you. Kyle Pitts did something, 6.8 fantasy points. Good matchup against the Raiders, but it's just not enough. And I've said for weeks, same thing. You can drop Kyle Pitts. We can move on from this situation. Bijan Robinson, Drake London are the only consistent factors in this offense. Everybody else, I mean, maybe a sprinkle of Darnell Mooney, but everybody else here I'm just avoiding from a fantasy perspective. So Cousins, Pitts, they are sits, as well as all the Giants options at quarterback and tight end here in Week 16. Next up, we'll have the Patriots traveling to face the Bills. Let's start with the Patriots, and I was very close to putting Drake May in the streaming category, and I do think there's some streaming capacity here, especially in like double quarterback super flex formats. But it's fantasy playoffs. Do you really need to risk Drake May? I just don't think so. But he does have 18 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games with a ceiling of 20.4 fantasy points. But the Bills defense pretty good against quarterbacks, although the past 2 weeks they've been pretty awful. But I mean, Drake is okay. He's 19 of 23 this past week, 202 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, 14 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So you're desperate, and there's nobody better. I do think he's semi-streamable, but I just don't know that you need to risk it. Hunter Henry lives in the streaming category for me, but he did kind of not have a great game this past week with 6.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 catches, and 25 receiving yards. The Bills not so bad against tight ends as well on the season, so a little bit of a lower tier stream, but for the most part, he's been pretty solid in that category. Moving along, Josh Allen, you always start no matter what, and nothing's going to change your mind. I mean, after the last 2 weeks, Josh Allen could have 5 points this week, and you would still start him the following week if you made it into the championship, because he essentially has 93 points over his last 2 games. 5 passing touchdowns in the last 2 weeks and 5 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. So not going to break this down too extensively, but it's a good matchup at home. The Bills trying to chase the Chiefs for that number 1 overall seed in the AFC potentially. So they will be doing everything to win this game and probably laying it pretty heavy on the Patriots. So Josh Allen, a must-start quarterback. You guys know that. Dalton Kincaid, in his first game back in 3 weeks, did show up a bit against the Lions. Everyone kind of showed up, though. 9.3 fantasy points, 7 targets, 4 catches, 53 receiving yards. Dawson Knox had 6.2 fantasy points on his end, 3 targets, 2 grabs, 42 receiving yards. So there's an argument for both those guys, but the single digits make me just not that excited. So you probably have better options, but maybe there's an argument for Kincaid here at the end of the season. But this offense is so unpredictable. We're probably going to get a lot of James Cook, a lot of Josh Allen, Khalil Shakir. Everybody else is basically a question mark on a weekly basis. They could get involved, or they could be duds. So I'm going to avoid Kincaid and Knox going into Week 16. Moving along, we got the Cardinals traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with Kyler Murray, who I was going to move to a sit, and I left him in the category. Depends on what you got. Don't have anything better. I think you can roll with him. The Panthers have allowed the 27th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So, yeah, it was bad this past week, but I still think he's startable. 23 of 30, 224 passing yards, 11 yards on the ground in Week 15 against the Patriots in a smash matchup. No passing touchdowns, no rushing touchdowns, no turnovers. It really depends on what you got. Am I excited about starting Kyler Murray? No, but he did have 17 or more fantasy points in the previous 2 weeks before this past week, and still has 21 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 7, or really I should say 19 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 7, except for 4. So, what do we expect out of this offense on a weekly basis is exactly what I said last week. Probably going to get some James Conner for sure, right? Going to get Trey McBride for sure. Maybe you'll get some Marvin Harrison Jr., maybe not. You just don't know what to expect outside of that, and you don't know what to expect out of Kyler on a weekly basis. So, startable, let's just leave it at that. Trey McBride, however, like I just said, is going to get involved. He's probably not going to score a touchdown, but this is a good matchup. The Panthers have been very bad against tight ends on the season thus far. So if you own McBride, this might be the week where he scores a receiving touchdown, but he's going to get the volume. He's been fantastic. 17.7 fantasy points this past week, 10 targets, 9 grabs, 87 receiving yards. You got to keep rolling with McBride, who has double digits in every game on the season except for Week 3. So keep rolling with McBride. He is a must-start tight end, and this is a great matchup. On the other hand, we got the Panthers, Bryce Young, whoever's healthy at tight end, whoever's playing at tight end just sits here. Bryce Young kind of came back to earth this past week after a couple solid performances, and even if they haven't been great for fantasy, they've looked good in real life. But this last week was a little bit shakier and a pretty good matchup at home against Dallas. He was 19 of 28, 219 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 2 picks, a rushing touchdown, 12 yards on the ground. So the 2 picks kind of hurt that stat line. Outside of that, it was not that bad. But, the other thing was he had 2 lost fumbles. So, yeah, kind of came back to earth, right? We're going to leave him as a sit. We haven't had him as a start. We had him as a streaming option against the Bucs in Week 13, and he might be a streaming option in Week 17 against the Bucs. But outside of that, we're just going to leave Bryce Young as a sit. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Bears, and boy, oh boy. Jared Goff, 41 fantasy points in Week 15, 38 of 59, 494 passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns. Crazy performance, one of the best quarterback performances in Week 15. How do I feel about him this week? Because he still has been very up and down. Like, you look since Week 10, 12.8, 34.5, 10.7, 16.9, 23 points. 41 points. He's all over the place. I think he's in the start category because I think it's really hard to ignore this past week. Plus, we kind of have this interesting conundrum here where David Montgomery's gone down. Is that going to force this team to play a little bit differently? Obviously, they're going to give Gibbs a ton of volume, but maybe some other players are going to have to step up here at the wide receiver position, at the tight end position, and maybe that 1-2 punch that really drove a lot of their game scripts isn't going to quite be there with Craig Reynolds now as the RB2, at least assuming he'll be the RB2. So I don't think this team's going to suffer too much, but then the other aspect is their defense is so banged up. I mean, just some of the worst luck maybe any team on the season in terms of injuries. So that could also put them in a position where they're going to need to throw the football more. We'll find out. So I was close to actually leaving Goff in the category because that's where I've had him because he's been so volatile. But I think he's a solid start. Bear in mind, though, on the season, a lot of you guys hate on the Bears and say every time I bring up the Bears defense, they're like, oh, quit telling me the Bears are a bad matchup. But on the season, the Bears have allowed the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so just keep that in mind as well. Sam Laporta, startable, good start, 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, 18.1 fantasy points this past week. This is a player who I do think the Lions will lean on a bit more as the season wraps up. with no David Montgomery. And obviously, like, Monty's just a running back is what some of you guys might be thinking, but he's so crucial to the way this offense flows that I do think guys like Laporta and Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams and maybe even Tim Patrick will be called on a bit more outside of the obvious that Gibbs is going to get a ton of volume. Brock Wright, 0 catches this past week. He's a sit. Okay, let's move on to the Bears. Caleb Williams, tough week this past week. 18 of 31, 191 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 3 yards on the ground, a lost fumble, 9.9 fantasy points. He is getting butchered with that offensive line play. He's getting hit left and right. Can't get the ball out to his receivers. The run game is not there. Tough matchup against the Lions, but this Lions defense, very banged up, like I said. So I got Caleb as a sit because I'm not risking it in the second round of the playoffs, but he might have some streaming capacity. The last time he played the Lions in week 13, did have 26 fantasy points. Cole Kmet, 2.4 points this past week. He's a sit for me. I'm going to avoid the Bears quarterbacks and tight ends here in week 16. Okay, let's move along to the Titans, who are traveling to face the Colts. And once again, I'll try and make this as painless as possible. Will Levis got benched this past week. 3 interceptions, a lost fumble, negative 1.4 fantasy points. Don't know if it's going to be him or Mason Rudolph this week. Doesn't really matter. They're both going to be sits, I would argue, if you were in some strange dimension where you had to start either Titans quarterback this week. If Mason gets the start, he's a much better start. He did have 16 fantasy points against the Bengals this past week. It's not a bad matchup against the Colts. It's another good matchup in week 17 against the Jags if he's the guy, but just no thank you. Chicken Conquo had a solid game this past week, but he's been incredibly inconsistent and only has 2 double-digit performances on the season, so I will avoid all Titans tight ends in week 16. Had Anthony Richardson as a sit this past week. Moving along to the Colts here. He was okay. 16 fantasy points, 17 of 38, 172 passing yards, 2 picks, 46 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown. I could see a similar stat line to that this week, but it's just not enough. The passing game wasn't good. The receivers weren't involved. It was a tougher matchup this past week against the Broncos, but I just have no interest in risking Anthony Richardson in my starting lineup in the second round of the fantasy playoffs. And as it's been for weeks, there's no tight end on this team that is fantasy relevant. So let's avoid all Colts tight ends. And yeah, let's avoid everybody for the Titans and Colts at quarterback and tight end here in week 16. Next up, we have the Rams, who will be traveling to face the Jets. Let's start with the Rams side of things. And Matthew Stafford coming off of an awful game, just 8.2 fantasy points. Believe it or not, that was his fourth worst performance on the season. So 16 to 27, 160 passing yards, 18 yards on the ground. But I got him as a streaming option this week because the Jets have allowed the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and I think that he can easily bounce back. We've already seen him do it on the season as is. So, the Rams are in this position. They're atop of their division right now, but they got to stay atop of their division. They got to do everything they can to continue to win football games as we wrap up the season. So, should be a good game script. And the Jets have shown they're not going to just roll over. They're not playing for anything, but I guess Aaron Rodgers' reputation. So they're probably going to make this game a little bit more difficult than you might think, and they're not just going to let the Rams walk out of their stadium with a victory. So should be a good game script. The matchup's not bad. We still got Puka Nacua here. I know Kupp had a goose egg last week, but we still got Cooper Kupp, Kyron Williams. So I think Stafford is streamable, but I'm not going to put him past that. Don't forget, we're not that far removed from 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4, not including this past week, and 2 or more passing touchdowns in all those games. No Rams tight ends that I need to waste time going over. There's nobody that we need to even consider. Aaron Rodgers, kind of went back and forth on Rodgers as well, but I'm going to put him in the streaming category because he's been okay overall the last 2 weeks and was very good this past week. But the elephant in the room would be that he played the Jags this past week and a little bit of a tougher matchup on paper, at least, compared to the Jags this week against the Rams. But the Rams, also not that great. They've allowed the 23rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So 289 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 45 yards on the ground for Rodgers this past week. Streamable, but don't get too excited. Tyler Conklin did not play this last week. Shout out to Tyler Conklin and his family on their new child being born, or actually his first child being born. But nonetheless, whoever it is at tight end here, whether Conklin's active or not, or if it's Jeremy Ruckert, we're not starting any Jets tight ends in week 16. So let's just move along. Rodgers, Stafford, streamable. No tight ends in this matchup here in week 16. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Commanders. And for all you guys overthinking Jalen Hurts, just come on. You got a player like Hurts, Allen, Jackson. You start these guys. Everyone's saying, "Oh, I don't know, it's the Steelers, Joey Porter Jr. Should I bench A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith?" Start these guys. And yeah, keep starting Barkley too. You just can't afford to bench these caliber of players. And yes, Jalen Hurts and the Eagles can still throw the football if they want to. Maybe that hurts Saquon Barkley when they want to, but nonetheless, they can still do it. Hurts 25 of 32, 290 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 45 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 28 fantasy points. Just keep rolling with Jalen Hurts no matter what. This is a big divisional game with playoff implications for both teams. It's going to be a good matchup here on the road, so go ahead and roll with Hurts. Solid floor, high ceiling. No reason to bench Jalen Hurts. Grant Calcaterra filling in for Dallas Goedert. We liked him as a streaming option in Week 14 due to the matchup. Did not like him this past week. Don't really like him this week. There should be better options out there. Jaden Daniels, another guy that I had to argue with you guys about. Luckily, haven't had to as of late. But after those 2 down matchups against Pittsburgh and Philly, and I just kept telling you guys, don't overthink it. These were 2 really rough matchups. He's a little bit banged up. He's going to bounce back. He was my must-start quarterback in Week 12. Highly encourage you guys to keep him in your lineups in Week 13. Highly encourage you guys to start him this past week, and he has shown out. He's your quarterback 6 on the season. 23 fantasy points this past week, 25 of 31, 226 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 66 yards on the ground. Don't care what the matchup is. Yes, he is facing Philly, who didn't have a good game against last time, but I just have a tough time benching Jaden Daniels, so I'm going to continue to roll with him unless you have somebody who you just feel absolutely better about. But once again, there's only 5 quarterbacks on the season ahead of Jaden Daniels. At this point on the season. Zach Ertz is banged up in concussion protocol. So if Zach Ertz does not play this week, it's going to leave a little bit of Ben Sinnott and maybe a little bit of John Bates. They both had a catch this past week, so not enough for me. If we don't get Ertz this week, I'm staying away from the Commanders' tight ends. If it's Ertz, he's still startable. He was having a decent game before he did get hurt. But just keep in mind, he's coming out of concussion protocol, and it's not a great matchup, but the last time he played Philly, he did have his best fantasy performance on the season with 18.7 fantasy points. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But for the most part, I do like this matchup. Should be a good competitive divisional matchup that does have playoff implications. So try not to overthink this one and start your studs here in Week 16. Next up, we have the Browns, who are traveling to face the Bengals. Let's start with famous Jameis Winston himself. What do we do with Jameis Winston this week? Is Jameis Winston going to be the starting quarterback or not? That's going to be the bigger question, I think. And I went pretty back and forth on this one. But 3 interceptions this past week, a fumble, -2 rushing yards, 146 passing yards, 2 fantasy points against the Chiefs definitely doesn't feel great. And if he's not the starter, that's going to leave Dorian Thompson-Robinson as a starter. But, I mean, he wasn't very good against the Chiefs either. 18 passing yards, a pick, 16 yards on the ground. So I don't know who we're going to get. If it's DTR, I'm not touching it. I'm staying far away. If it's Winston, he still gets the asterisk, but he's still streamable. It's a good matchup against the Bengals. And I'll just leave it at that. And I've said it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I've taken some heat about Jameis Winston too, but I've said at some point he's going to come back to earth, and anytime you start him, you're playing with fire because the turnovers are going to be there. Yeah, they're going to throw the football. Yeah, you're going to get some good performances, but the fire's still burning, right? And at some point, it'll come back to earth here, and it may have been this past week that we finally saw that, right? Because you take away the snow game, he was pretty solid. And, I mean, maybe the Chargers game, too. He was pretty solid as a streaming option. And he obviously had the huge game against Denver, good game against the Saints, good game against the Ravens for the most part. But even in those games, there's still plenty of Jameis apparent, right? Nonetheless, he gets the Bengals this week. He is streamable if he's a starter. But I think I've made my point. David Njoku missed this past week with a hamstring injury. Hopeful to play this week. If he does play, leaving him in the start category regardless of the quarterback situation, but maybe his ceiling is lowered if it's DTR. If he doesn't play, then Jordan Atkins gets the start more than likely. I'm staying away from Jordan Atkins. But if Njoku plays, startable. If Winston gets the start, streamable. But proceed with caution. Okay, Joe Burrow, we are going to continue to start no matter what. I mean, wasn't as good this past week as he's been in previous weeks, but still had 18.8 fantasy points, 26 to 37, 271 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, a lost fumble, but Burrow's your QB4 on the season. It's a good matchup against the Browns. And the Bengals are in absolute win-now territory. They have to continue to win every single game in order to make the playoffs. So Burrow and the Bengals going to be in these type of game scripts that benefit us from a fantasy perspective. So keep starting Joe Burrow. Mike Gesicki, just not enough there. 6.7 fantasy points this past week. I'm not interested going in to week 16. Next up, we have the Vikings traveling to face the Seahawks. Let's take a look at Sammy D. Not a great week for Darnold in week 15. 24-40, 231 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and 1 interception. Just 12.2 fantasy points. We saw Aaron Jones run for a touchdown. We saw Cam Akers run for a touchdown. And we saw the Vikings defense really step up. So I don't want to punish Sam Darnold for this performance. I've been very vocal about Sam Darnold the past couple weeks, and I think he can easily bounce back this week against the Seahawks. And the Vikings, one of these teams, they can catch the Lions. They can win this division, and they play the Lions in week 18. So they're going to try and do whatever they can to win the next 2 weeks against Seattle and Green Bay. Getting very interesting in that division, right? So listen, on the season, Darnold has under 17.2 fantasy points 4 times. Okay, he's been fantastic. He's still the QB8 on the season. I'm not going to overreact to a game where the running backs took away a lot of touchdowns and the defense basically did everything in this game. Sam Darnold and the passing attack just weren't really necessary. And even with that being said, I mean, Justin Jefferson still had a big game. Jordan Addison still had a solid game. So, and TJ Hawkinson, who we'll talk about in a second here, also had a solid game. So I'm not worried about Darnold. I'm not going to lower him into like the streaming category. I still think top 10 quarterback on the season, in win now territory. Go ahead and roll with Darnold this week. Hawkinson, 10.2 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 52 receiving yards. I am still worried about Hawkinson. He has not been on the field for more than 68% of snaps in a single game. We still see a little bit of Johnny Munt. We still see a little bit of Josh Oliver. But Hawkinson is getting the majority of the targets and receptions. Just bear in mind, like, I keep taking heat for being a little bit lower on Hawkinson, but last 4 games, 18.4, 5.8, 8.5, 10.2. He has a lot of volatility. He's not on the field for all the snaps at the position, but he remains a good streaming option. It just depends on what else you have, and just don't always expect double digits from Hawkinson. You might not get them. Okay, looking at the Seahawks. Geno Smith is expected to practice this week, dealing with that knee injury. May or may not play this week. We'll find out. Not in on Geno Smith this week. Haven't been in on Geno Smith in weeks. Not in on Sam Howell if he gets the start, and no interest in Noah Fant at tight end. And this is a tough matchup against the Vikings. They're not as good against the passing attack as they are against the run, but I got a bad feeling about the Seahawks offense this week from these two positions at least. There might be some life for the running backs and receivers, but quarterbacks, tight ends, I got no interest going into Week 16. Next up, we have the Jaguars, who are going to travel to face the Raiders. Mac Jones, not that bad this past week. 20 fantasy points, 31 of 46. 294 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, 29 yards on the ground. Give Mac Jones some flowers, but he had a solid game in Week 13 with 20 fantasy points and then 7 fantasy points in Week 14 before this past week. So I'm not risking Mac Jones. It's not the worst matchup. It's actually a good matchup, but I'm not doing it. I can't. And even in double quarterback super flex formats, please don't do this. Just let's avoid Mac Jones. You just have no idea what's going to happen. However, with Evan Ingram on IR, we got the Strange man back. That's Brenton Strange, one of our early season streaming options, and he had a big week in Week 15, 18.3 fantasy points, 12 targets, 11 grabs, 73 receiving yards, and the Raiders have been very allowing to opposing tight ends on the season, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to tight ends. So it's a solid matchup for Brenton Strange. He sits at 7% rostered. He's in the streaming category for me this week. Moving along to the Raiders. Don't exactly know what we're going to get at quarterback here. Aiden O'Connell kind of was ruled out kind of last minute there, so to speak, against the Jags, which led Desmond Ridder to be the starter. And he was not great. 23 of 39, 208 passing yards, a passing touchdown to Amir Abdullah at the very end of the game, 2 picks, 28 yards on the ground, 13 fantasy points. So it is a good matchup here. But like with O'Connell barely coming off the injury, like I know he had the good game in Week 13, but it's the fantasy playoffs. I'm not risking this. The matchups there, you're desperate, double quarterback, super flex, dynasty. That's about it. Deep formats, maybe, if O'Connell gets a start, but I just don't want to risk it. I'll just leave it at that. Now, the most concerning thing for the Raiders offense was that Brock Bowers was negatively impacted by the quarterback situation with just 6.5 fantasy points this past week, and the week before, 8.2 fantasy points. So I'm going to leave him in the start category. I don't think I would lower him regardless, but the reason why I feel okay is because he gets the Jaguars, who have been awful all season long against opposing tight ends. So I'm going to try not overthink this one. I'm going to continue to roll with Brock Bowers. I think he could bounce back, have a solid game this week against the Jaguars, and we might even get Aiden O'Connell back this week, which would have a positive impact on Brock Bowers. So let's try not to think too much about the last 2 weeks for Bowers. Good matchup. He's been fantastic on the season. Let's roll with him in Week 16. Moving along, we have the Niners traveling to face the Dolphins. And, Brock Purdy, what are we going to do with you? 4.9 fantasy points on Thursday Night Football, 14 of 31, 142 passing yards, a pick, 3 yards on the ground, no touchdowns. I got him in the category. He maybe needs to be a little bit lower, but streamable, startable. I still think he is. Call me crazy. Is he my favorite? No, absolutely not. And if you want to flat out sit him, that's fine. It is a tough matchup against the Dolphins, but double quarterback super flex, I still think there's something potentially here. The Niners are technically still in the playoff race. They have a 1% chance of making it, but they're going to do whatever they can to win this game against the Dolphins. So there might be something here. He's probably my least favorite of the category this week, but the Dolphins also have to win this game to continue to have a playoff hope and dream stay alive. So we could get a good game script here. Tough matchup for Purdy, though. Look at your options. George Kittle remains in the start category, was fine this past week, 10 fantasy points. 7 targets, 4 catches, 61 receiving yards. I'll continue to roll with George Kittle if I own him. He is the tight end 1 thus far on the fantasy season, so don't overthink that one. Now, Tua Tagovailoa, one of my favorite starts this past week, and a lot of people really liked Tua this past week. Good matchup, good game script. 6 fantasy points, 29 of 40, 196 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and 3 picks after he had 23 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games and 2 or more passing touchdowns in 4 straight games. And he also had a fumble that was lost this past week. So I'm going to leave him in the start category. Maybe you move him down to like the type area. But once again, the Dolphins have to do whatever they can to win this football game and keep their playoffs dreams and hopes alive. So I think Tua is very startable, but you want to argue he should be a little bit lower. That's fair. Worth noting that Jalen Waddle avoided a serious knee injury and is considered day-to-day, so we might see Waddle play this week, which will help Tua. I get it. The odds aren't exactly there for Tua. They're kind of stacked against him, but he still has been really solid the past couple weeks outside of this past week. So I'm going to try and forget this past week and say that he is still very startable this week. Jonnu Smith, however, remains a must-start. Past very startable. He had another monster week this past week in week 15. 19.8 fantasy points, 9 receptions off 11 targets, 48 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Since week 11 of the season, he has 5 touchdowns and 13 or more fantasy points in every game in that stretch. Let's keep rolling with Jonnu Smith if we own him going into week 16. All right, going into Sunday Night Football, we're going to have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Cowboys. Baker Money Maker. 29 fantasy points in Week 15 in a tough matchup. 22 of 27, 288 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, a pick, 25 yards on the ground. First half was a little sluggish. Second half, Baker just lit that Chargers defense up. The run game is great for the Bucs. Mike Evans is balling out. Jalen McMillan is stepping up. Cade Otton, Sterling Shepard are doing things when called upon. You got to start Baker Mayfield. This is a great matchup against the Cowboys. The Bucs are going to be doing whatever they can to win this football game to help ensure that they win the NFC South with the Falcons winning on Monday Night Football. That race is still close, so this is a great spot for Baker. He is a must-start quarterback, your quarterback 5 on the season so far. And I absolutely love Baker Mayfield's line on Underdog going into Week 16, currently sitting at 247.5 passing yards. He's hit that in each of his last 2 games. Smash matchup this week against the Cowboys. The Bucs need to come out of this game with a victory. They're going to have their foot on the gas and they're not going to take it off. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Baker Mayfield's total passing yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting that free NFL Pick 'em for Week 16. Take your free Pick 'em. Take the over on Baker's total passing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you sign up using promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Cade Otton's just a streaming option, very volatile, has had a low ceiling as of late. Not really my favorite start this week, but he is streamable if you're desperate, but just 4.4 fantasy points this past week and 10 or less fantasy points in every game since week 10. His ceiling is just not really there. The run game, Mike Evans taking over for this offense. But if you're desperate, he is streamable, but that's about it. Cooper Rush, on the other hand, we did have as a streaming option this past week, and he did come through in a solid matchup with 21 fantasy points, 18 of 29, 214 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 5 yards on the ground, and it's another solid matchup this week as the Bucs have allowed the 31st most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Cooper Rush, streamable again here in Week 16. He has 17 or more fantasy points in 3 of his 5 starts since Dak has gone down. Jake Ferguson, Luke Schoonmaker, I mean, we thought there might be some life this past week in a good matchup against the Panthers. And Brevin Spanford, the rookie out of Minnesota, also had a catch. But not a lot of life here. Those 3 tight ends combined for less than 5.5 fantasy points. So I'm going to stay away from the tight end situation, which is becoming a bit of a timeshare in Dallas. So let's just stay away here. You don't need to risk this in the fantasy playoffs. So they didn't get it done against Carolina, who have allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends. Even though it's another good matchup this week, I'm going to avoid this matchup, even trying to stream a Cowboys tight end in Week 16. And last but certainly not least, on Monday Night Football, we're going to have the Saints traveling to face the Packers. Jake Haener got benched this past week. He was 4 of 10, 49 yards passing, an interception, 7 yards on the ground. Had 1.6 fantasy points. Spencer Rattler came in, was better, 10 of 21, 135 passing yards, a touchdown, and 9.4 fantasy points. But just, come on. Just no. There's no world that you need to start either of these quarterbacks this week. Jawan Johnson, 3.2 fantasy points this past week. I'm not risking him. Foster Moreau, 13.9 this past week. I'm not risking him either. Moreau had 6 points in week 14. Johnson had 15. Just too volatile. Don't do it. This could be a really ugly day for the Saints offensively and defensively on the road here in Lambeau against a humming Packers team. Now, even though this Packers team is humming, I don't really trust Jordan Love. I've just kind of had him in the category. 17.5 fantasy points this past week, 20 of 27, 229 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 4 yards on the ground. I mean, Jordan Love is fine, but that's about it. Like, this is probably going to be a big day for Josh Jacobs. He's probably going to have like 3 rushing touchdowns. The Saints have been awful against running backs, so Jordan Love is startable, but I just don't know if he has a high ceiling. In the past 3 weeks show that 18 or less fantasy points in 4 straight games. So, listen, the Packers are going to play defense, they're going to run the football, they're going to get one of their 3 wide receivers involved, maybe some Tucker Kraft, but it's just not a formula that adds to a ton of fantasy points outside of Josh Jacobs and maybe the Packers defense on a consistent basis. So Jordan Love startable, but that's all I'm going to leave him as. And Tucker Kraft, I keep saying it, startable, and he did show up for 3 straight weeks, but this is why he doesn't go into the start category for me. 5.4 points this past week, 2 targets, 2 catches, 34 receiving yards, and no touchdowns. He only has 1 game on the season where he has not scored a touchdown and has had double digits. So very touchdown dependent. Still a good option, but very volatile, risky, solid, but risky. That's what Tucker Kraft is, and we're going to leave it at that going in to Week 16. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single quarterback, and every single tight end as we move in to the second round of the fantasy playoffs and who you guys should be sitting or starting going into the week. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 16, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. As always, more importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the videos, because we're going to have everything that you guys could possibly need to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.